What is up, everybody? We're back. Core Use Bloody History. So today we're going to start on the testimony of Myrtle Evans. I'm not sure how long it is. It's at least 8 to 10 pages. We might be able to get through it today, but if it's beyond 10, definitely not. So Myrtle Evans is a key witness in the story of the Oswald deception. She is a friend of the original Marguerite Oswald going back to 1930, and she was the landlord of Marguerite and Lee when they lived at 1454 and 1452 St. Mary in New Orleans. As we'll see, they didn't show up there till May of 54, right? But we've got Harvey at Beauregard starting in January of 54. I've pretty much eliminated the possibility that Harvey Oswald was at Beauregard prior to January, because when you go through the testimony of Myra DeRoos, you'll clearly hear that she met Harvey in January semester of 1954. So he had come in mid-year. And while he was living at 126 Exchange Place, starting January of 54, Lee Oswald and his mother are living at 1454 and 1452 St. Mary. We'll get into the why there's two addresses there, 1452 and 1454. But, so Myrtle Evans, she ends up popping up in the story later. Harvey Oswald, who this woman didn't know, who looks like his brother, Lee Oswald, because I'm convinced they're brothers at this point. It's all but certain to me. Harvey will show up in New Orleans and go to her, and she will help him find an apartment. And then he moves into the apartment at 4904 or 4905 Magazine Street. So let's begin. Testimony of Myrtle Evans. The testimony of Mrs. Myrtle Evans was taken on April 7th, 1964 at the old Civil Courts Building, Royal and Conti Streets, New Orleans, Louisiana, by Mr. Albert Jenner, Jr., Assistant Counsel of the President's Commission. Mrs. Myrtle Evans, 1910 Britannia Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, after first being duly sworn, testifies as follows. You're Mrs. Myrtle Evans, is that right? Yes, sir. And your husband is Julian Evans, and he accompanied you here today, is that right? Yes, sir. He's waiting outside until you complete your deposition? Yes. Mrs. Evans, are you a native of New Orleans? Yes, sir. And your husband? Yes, he was born in New York, but he was raised in New Orleans. And you were born here? Yes, I was. And you have no family, is that right? That's right. Well, I have no immediate family. I have brothers and sisters. I don't have any children. All right, are you acquainted with a person named Marguerite Oswald? Jesus Christ, dogs. Yes, she was a very good friend of mine. When did you first become acquainted with her? In about 1930. 1930? Something like that. She was then about 26 or 27 years old, is that right? Well, I guess that's about right. She's either 56 or 57 right now. Well, yes, she was about that then, I guess. I had met her between 1925 and 1930, about a time I played cards with her. What kind of cards? Bridge. We played bridge, yes. How do you become acquainted with her? Well, through a mutual friend, hers and mine, we used to play bridge together. Was she married then? She was separated from her first husband. Where did she live then? Do you know? I think at that particular time she had a little apartment on North Carrollton. I never did visit her residence, so I don't know much about that. At that time, she was living with her sister that lived right off of City Park, but it seemed she had a basement apartment on North Carrollton. I don't think she was living there at that particular time. She did move in with her sister later, and from time to time she was with her, but at that particular time, I don't think she was. What's her sister's name? Oh, I forget. Moret? Yes, Mrs. Moret. Lillian Moret. Yes, her first name is Lillian. Yes, that's right. Did that acquaintance continue for some years? Well, I sort of quit playing cards and I went and took an accounting course and went back to work, and I had not seen her for a while, and she remarried to Oswald. You learned of that, did you? Yes, to Oswald. Did you see her from time to time therein? Well, I wasn't playing cards during that time or anything, but I might have run into her. I imagine I did on the street, but I lost contact with her, sort of. And then it was either just before Lee's birth or just after his birth. I can't remember. It has been so many years, but I met her on the corner of Canal and St. Charles. I think it was after Lee's birth. I think her husband had died, and I think she had just taken the baby to the doctor or something. I think she told me that they had wanted to have a little girl, but I can't remember all of that. Just the way it happened, That's been such a long time, but I can't remember meeting her. I just can't remember, though, if it was after her husband died, or if she was expecting a baby, or if she was the one that wanted a little girl. I can't remember if that was after the child was born. Most likely, it was that she hoped that she would have a little girl. Now, a lot of this was told to me after we became friends again as to what happened. I didn't attend her husband's funeral or anything, and I didn't start seeing a good deal of her again until, she finally went to work downtown, and I happened to run into her or something like that. She was working for, I think, the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and I was, the fucking Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. Hang on a second, I'll get to that in a minute. And I was a widow, and she was a widow, and we sort of regained our friendship. Okay, so, oh my God, the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. I don't buy this story at all. And I'll tell you why, because I already dug into this, and I already explained this a couple times, but let me explain it again. So she goes and joins the fucking Navy in 1941-ish. We have the document showing she was in New Jersey, connected to the Nazis and whatever the fuck is going on up there. We find out about the 980-plus page file on Marguerite Oswald, held by Office of Naval Intelligence. And so during this time, she's allegedly in Algiers. She's not. She's in New York. And then what she tells people is she's working for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, which doesn't really make any sense because when you dig into the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, they had a contract with the goddamn Navy. And if I remember this correctly, they made the glass that was either in nuclear reactors or in submarines, or something along those lines. They had a military contract to make military-grade glass. It wasn't just like a regular old glass company. So it's funny because she joins the Navy, becomes a phone operator in the Navy, which I've already talked about, requires you went through Into the Waves program and had the security clearance. Because the telephone operators were connecting people who were important, who had high-level security clearances, and you could listen in on the phone calls because that was just how it worked. And so you had to have security clearance when you worked as a phone operator for the Navy, right? But then she gives an alibi to people that she works for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, which is hilarious. I fucking swear to God, these are not like James Bond level fucking spooks. These people are morons. I mean, they didn't know back then. They didn't think anyone would ever catch on, right? The availability to information we have today to be able to retroactively examine this stuff is unbelievable. They never could have comprehended that we would have ever looked into any of this or figured it out. They never thought the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company would ever show up in anything, right? But it did. It did. They were so short-sighted, as we are today in regards to what we should expect 50 years from now, right? All right, let me continue. I didn't attend her husband's funeral or anything, and I didn't start seeing a good deal of her again until, she finally went to work downtown, and I happened to run into her or something like that. She was working for, I think, the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and I was a widow, and she was a widow, and we sort of regained our friendship. Your husband, in the meantime, had died? Yes, I'm now married to Mr. Evans. Your first husband, was he also native-born American? Oh, yes. Now, I met Lee's aunt one day at a card party. That's Mrs. Moret. Yes, Lillian Moret, and I hadn't seen her in years. I'm a Catholic and she's a Catholic, you see, and so they had this card party or some kind of an affair over at the Fontainebleau Motel, and a number of ladies were present, and it was for charity, and we played bingo and canasta and things, and she was selling aprons. And so she said, "Oh, Myrtle, did you hear about Lee? He gave up his American citizenship and went to Russia behind the Iron Curtain." And I said, "Oh my God, no." And she said, "Yes." Okay, let me pause right here. Because once again, it's thrown in our face that Lillian Moret lied in her testimony, right? Because Lillian, oh my God, she changes her story so many times and she's never called out on it. So one of her stories is that she says that she didn't know Lee joined the Marines, didn't go to Russia or nothing until he showed back up in 63. Well, that's total nonsense because Harvey was at her house in 62 for Thanksgiving. So she lied there. What else did she lie about? She lied about not having talked to her sister who would have told her that Lee went off to Russia, and again sticks to the story that she didn't know until Lee showed up at her house. But we know that he showed up at her house in fatigues one time, and they took him out shopping into lunch, and he had a duffel bag with him. And so she ends, and then we have the photograph of Marilyn Dorothea Moret, Lillian Moret, and someone we're told is Oswald that I fucking promise you is not Oswald. There's that picture which was taken, but we're told that's Oswald. But she's not supposed to have seen Oswald at that time because that was prior to the summer of '63 when he shows up, right? So this fucking bitch is so full of shit. And we didn't know she was working. She was working in 1959 when he defects to the Soviet Union, or early 1960. She's selling aprons. What the fuck? She never mentions this. There's no mention of her ever being an apron salesman ever anywhere. I mean, the holes in her story and the lack of explanation for her flights to the Bermuda Air Force Base and to Cuba and Canada. I'm going crazy here, people. I need to understand this stuff, and none of it makes any sense, and she lies about everything. Well, after that, I didn't hear about it anymore. I lost contact. When was this? In 59, 60? Well, I would say 2 to 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago, because I've been to those affairs, I think, twice since. Was that the first you knew or had become aware of the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was living in Russia? Yes. Now, it was undoubtedly in the newspapers and on TV, but sometimes I get to doing a million things and don't get a chance to read the newspaper. I just skip it. And if I don't get around to it, I skip the news on TV too, even the late news. So a lot of times I don't know what's going on, but she said, "Did you hear about Lee?" And I said, "No. What about Lee?" She said, "You didn't see it in the paper. Lee has gone and give up his United States citizenship." And I said, "Poor Marguerite, that's terrible. I feel so sorry for her." "You knew Lee Harvey Oswald?" "Yes, I knew him very well. I knew his mother before he was born, and I knew him since he was a little tyke. Lillian took care of him for a while, you see. She had 2 boys, one by her first marriage, and it wasn't her fault that they got a divorce." What? Hold a second. Hold on a second. Okay. Let me see if I'm reading this correctly. "You knew Lee Harvey Oswald?" "Yes, I knew him very well. I knew his mother before he was born, and I knew him since he was a little tyke. Lillian took care of him for a while, you see." We all know that because the story about the Bethlehem orphanage and all that stuff, we've covered that before. And so then she says she had 2 boys, one by her first marriage. That was John Pick. He didn't want the child, and he wanted her to destroy the child. Okay, so she's talking about Marguerite, and then Mr. Jenner says, when you say she had 2 boys, you're talking about Marguerite Oswald. Is that right? Yes. Hang on a second. Why do I get the feeling she just changed the subject? She did. She was asked about Lee, and she changed it to a Marguerite answer. That's very important. It might seem like the same thing, but it's not. When you say she had 2 boys, you're talking about Marguerite Oswald. Is that right? Yes. Marguerite had a terrifically sad life, and she was just a wonderful, gorgeous wife. She married this John Pick and had this boy, and he didn't want any children at all. So she left him and went to live with her sister, and Oswald, I think, was a Virginia life insurance salesman. He collected insurance from the sister. They lived right off City Park, and so one day Margie was strolling with Robert in front of City Park, and Oswald bumped into them. Huh? Hold on a second. Hang on a second. They lived right off City Park, and so one day Margie was strolling with Robert in front of City Park, and Oswald bumped into them, and he asked them about him riding them home. Okay, so I don't understand. Hold on a second. I don't understand whatsoever. They lived right off City Park, and so one day Margie was strolling with Robert in front of City Park, and Oswald bumped into them, and he asked about giving him a ride home. Okay, this doesn't make any sense because he's supposed to be Robert. He's Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr. So how the fuck is Margie strolling with Robert in front of City Park, but Oswald bumped into them? Do you see what I'm saying here? She's indicating she's walking with her child, strolling with Robert. So I'm assuming she means, well, not that wouldn't make sense either, because she was already with Oswald. She was with Robert Oswald when John Pick was born. All right, so this is a major problem here. Is this an error in testimony? I don't know. Let me continue. Maybe we'll get some clarification here, but this doesn't make any sense at all. What did she say to him? Well, she let him. You see, he had been collecting insurance at the house and had spoken to Margie. At whose house? At the Myrtle house, and he had played with the baby. No, let's see. John was the baby at the time, and she was separated or divorced from her husband. I forget which now, but he supported John. So did she make a mistake here? Is this just a slip of the tongue? Is this a mistake? She was strolling with Robert in front of City Park, and Oswald bumped into them. And he asked them about riding home, and what did she say? Well, she let him, you see. He'd been collecting insurance at the house and spoken to Margie. At whose house? At the Myrtle house. And he played with the baby. No, let's see. John was the baby at that time, and she was separated or divorced from her husband, which is Ed Pick. I forget which now, but he supported John. You mean Mr. Pick supported John? You're talking about John Pick now. Yes, he continued to support him, and he sent a baby crib, and he did everything like that, but he didn't want to live with her because of the child. So John never did see his father until he was, about 18 years old or something like that. So that's why those two boys were so close in age, you see, because she met Oswald, and he started taking her out. He asked her if she would go out to dinner with him, and she'd been away from her husband for 1.5 years or 2 years. That's correct. They split they were together from 30 to 32. 32 is when John Pick is born. She gets with Robert Oswald shortly after that. They're together for several years before he dies in 39. So yeah, so far this timeline is accurate. It had been a year and a half or 2 years, and so she did, and then she married him, and she had this baby right away, which is Robert. And they bought a home around Alvar somewhere. She never told me all this now. Some of it I heard from other sources, like her sister and others, but she did tell me a lot of it because we got to be real good friends. Okay, so here what she's saying is she was separated from Ed Pick for 2 years, and then Robert Oswald got involved with her after after John Pick was born, and then Robert she had right away. She had this baby right away, which is Robert, and they bought a home. Okay, so the timing there is enough for him to be the real father of Robert Oswald Jr. Okay, let's say that with somewhat level of certainty. Well, I don't want to say certainty because who the fuck knows? This whole thing could be a sham. He could be fucking gay and this is just a beard marriage. I mean, who the fuck knows at this point, right? So we can't assume anything. And they bought a home around Alvar somewhere. She never told me all this. Some of it I heard from other sources like her sister and others. But she did tell me a lot because we got to be real good friends. She bought that home and they had the 2 boys and they were very happy. And then one day he was out mowing the lawn and he had this terrific pain. And she was several months pregnant with Lee. She called the doctor right away, but before the doctor could get there, the man was dead. He had a blood clot. So he left her with 2 babies and one on the way. He had a blood clot. I wonder if, because we've been told he had a heart attack. A blood clot could cause a heart attack, but I wonder how did he get a blood clot? Now he left her with $10,000, I think, in life insurance. So she sold her home. And by that time, her 2 boys were old enough. So here's another thing. The previous story was that she got $5,000. I think we have documentation that she actually got $5,000. But she's a total lying cunt, right? So she might have actually gotten $10,000. We don't know. But she's saying here pretty confidently he left her with $10,000. Now, $10,000 back then is like 100,000+ today. It's a ton of money. You could live on it fine for a while, especially if you're renting houses. So I need you to keep that in mind, because for the next couple of years, when she's crying that she's fucking broke everywhere, living in the hood by the railroad tracks, like, she got this money, all this money, and she's trying to give her kids away at the same time, right? So we have a lot of factors here going on. We got the death of Robert Oswald Sr. She's getting $10,000. She's crying. She's broke, so she has to give her kids up to the orphanage. Oswald is born October 39. By 41, Oswald's living with Lillian Moret, and you're telling me that Marguerite spent all this money, bought a couple of houses, is still crying that she's broke and having to work for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, but really she's documented as having connections to the Navy, where she was a phone operator, allegedly, for the Navy in Algiers, right? So do you see how all these factors here don't make sense? They're all contradictory, and none of it jives with her being broke. She had that kind of money. That would explain how she had the money to go stay up at the, the Belvedere Hotel up in New York at 2136 Broadway. That would make perfect sense. She stayed there for 3 weeks, right? So all of these factors to me indicate that she is completely lying. She never had money problems. She was a sociopath who didn't give a shit about her kids whatsoever. And she went off and joined the Navy. Those are the factors that's the conclusion I've come to based on all of these factors here. All right, so let me continue. Now, he left her with $10,000, I think, in insurance. So she sold her home, and by that time, her two boys were old enough. And so she put them in this home, Evangeline, I think it is, but I'm not sure about that. And first they were at, Evangeline might have been the very first one, but then they went to the Washington School, and then they went to the Bethlehem Orphanage in New Orleans, right? So they were shuffled to 3 different schools during this time. And allegedly she's working not for Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, but she's working for the hosiery company, right? The same hosiery company that has an address in New York City, right? Do you see all these weird factors here? So clearly this era is so important. I'd say 41 to mid 44 when they end up moving to the Ewing address. That is like a crucial time period that we need the documents on, and we're never going to get. I think it is, but I'm not sure about that. She bought a home over on, what's the name of that street off the back of St. Claude? Bartholomew? Yes, I guess that's it. Now she put the boys in this home. That's 1010 Bartholomew. The Bethlehem home. Yes, Bethlehem, that's it. That's when I became friendly with her again. She was living with her sister for a while, and Lee was with her, and the 2 older boys were at the home. Really, when was this? What time period is this we're talking about? She was paying her sister board, but now after her husband died, she went to work, and she had a woman taking care of the little boy. You mean Lee? Okay, so now she's talking about the Roaches. And remember, they were only at the Bartholomew address until October. Then they sell it, and then they go to the address on Pauline Street. But they're only at Pauline Street for, 3 weeks? Tops. You mean Lee? Yes. Why did she live there? Do you know? You mean on Bartholomew Street? Yes. Well, it was cheaper. She bought a cheaper home. She had lived on Alvar after she married Oswald. But after Oswald's death, she moved to Bartholomew. Wait a minute. I might be getting those streets confused. No, I guess that's right. Anyway, when Oswald died, he left her this $10,000 in insurance, and now I don't know whether the home was completely paid for or not, but she immediately put these boys in that home and went to work. Is that your information, that she immediately went to work rather than try to live for a while without working? She might have lived for a month or 2 or something without working, because I wasn't in contact with her, you see, but she had got this couple to come and stay with Lee, and someone said, what couple was that? It was the Roaches. I don't know the couple, what couple it was. Somebody, she had put an ad in the paper or something, some young couple. I don't know their names. She said people told her that when Lee was in his chair that he used to cry a lot, and that they thought they were whipping little Lee. So she came home unexpectedly one night, and the child had welts on his legs, and so she told him to get out and get out now. So then from there, she bought another house and sold that. And now this is what she told me. She told me that she bought this little double house, and she ran a sweet shop for a while in front there. Sweet shop? No, it was supposed to have been a little hosiery kind of shop that sold sewing supplies and stuff. Sweet shop? What the fuck are you talking about? She told you that she sold the house and bought a double. Yes, as I recall, she did. What's a double? That's really 2 houses side by side. You have a door here and a door here, 2 entrances. They call them flats or duplexes some places, but we call them doubles. Okay. I just wanted to make sure the record is clear on that. Mrs. Evans then said, so bought that little house and they moved in there with her 3 children. You notice they skipped over the entire time period of Oswald's birth through about 1 year old. They just dumped right over it. Was that over at 831 Pauline Street? Well, that sounds like the address. I never went there myself. I don't even know where Pauline Street is, to tell you the truth. It's downtown someplace. Then she left there, and Lee, I think, was still with the aunt, and the 2 boys were down at the other place, that home, and she got this job managing the hosiery store on Canal Street. And that's when I started seeing her again. And that was between 39 and 40, somewhere in there, in the early 40s. Okay, that would make sense if that was between 39 and 40, but that's at the time when she was not supposed to have been working, because she had that money, and she testified, I believe. We'll go back to Marguerite's testimony, or false Marguerite, but this 39 to 40 time period makes much more sense for the hosiery store than 41 and beyond, because 41 and beyond, I'm convinced she was up in New York. At that time, she was living where now? She was living with her sister then, I think, and Lee was with her, and the 2 boys were boarding at the Bethlehem house. She would go down on Sundays to see her 2 boys. How long did she remain with her sister? Well, I don't know how long she had been with her sister, but after she took this position, she finally went to Texas, and I don't know, I couldn't tell you how long, because I just started seeing her. Well, we would see each other on Saturday afternoon or Sunday, something like that, just go around a bit together. How old was Lee about that time? About 3 or 2 or what? He was 3 or 4 years old then. He eventually was placed in the Bethlehem home also, wasn't he? Well, she might have finally got him in, because her sister, as you know, had a big family of her own, and I think they maybe might have finally put him in there too. You see, they only had take them at these places after a certain age, generally about 3, I think. They have to be trained and all, and that's why Lee was always with her before that, and all her love. I think she dumped on Lee after her husband died. They have to be trained and all, and that's why Lee was always with her before that. And all her love, I think, she dumped on Lee after her husband died. She felt awful sorry for Lee because he never knew his father. He was born after his father died, and he was his baby. And she always sort of felt sorry for Lee for that reason, I think, and sort of leaned toward Lee. She felt sorry for Lee because he never knew his father, I think, just as any mother would. Now we would have information that sometime from 39 to 41, she resided on Alvar Street in New Orleans. Does that square with your recollection? Well, Alvar, that was where she had her home, wasn't it, on Alvar? Yes. I was told it was in that subdivision. And do you recall her selling that house? No, she told me she sold it, but I wasn't too friendly with her at that time, and I didn't know anything about that. I was working, and I didn't play cards, you see. Remember, the Alvar property didn't sell till 44. In the meantime, she rented it to Dr. Mancuso. And it was sold to Mr. Carlton, right, in 44. She was a friend of mine, actually, that I played cards with, and I wasn't too friendly with the girl at first, but only through cards. But at the time, I was sorry for her when I first learned that what her husband had done to her. But later, I lost contact with her all the way up till just about the time she went to Texas, or maybe it was about a year before she went to Texas. It's hard to recall those dates to tell what happened and what year that happened. That would have been around 1945 or 44, somewhere in there. Yes, along there. Do you recall her living on Atlantic Avenue in Algiers, Louisiana? Atlantic Avenue? Yes. No, I don't. But remember, 227 Atlantic Avenue is in Staten Island. That's why they couldn't figure this part out. But you do recall a period when her 2 older boys, John and Robert, were in the Bethlehem Orphan School. Oh, yes, I went there once with her, in fact. At that time, she was with the Moretts. Is that right, Mrs. Evans? That's right. Then she moved to Texas. Yes. With her children, of course. That's right. What occurred about that time? She married again. She married, and was that why she moved to Texas? That's why. She married a very, very fine man. Do you recall what his name was? You know what? I will give it to you. Ekdahl. Do you know how to spell that, Ekdahl? I don't remember, but I knew her during that period all right. So she didn't know her from early 40s, 40, 41, through the time when she was with Ekdahl, right? So there's a gap there because Marguerite wasn't in New Orleans. I don't remember, but I knew her during that period all right. Did you become acquainted with him, Mr. Ekdahl? Yes. What kind of man was he, Mrs. Evans? He was a very high caliber, very fine man, and he had a very fine position. The paper said he was dragged from pillar to post, but that wasn't true. It was his work that took him to places. That was why she went to New York, because of his position. All right, here we go. He didn't drag her from pillar to post at all. I don't know what happened to them because I didn't see them again. He died, and that's when she moved back to New Orleans, and they stayed in my apartment building. Aha, yep. Now I visited her in Dallas, and I knew Eddie Ekdahl. Okay, so we need to break this paragraph down here. He was very high caliber, a very fine man, and he had a very fine position. The papers said she was dragged from pillar to post, but that wasn't true. It was his work that took them to places. That's why she went to New York, because of his position. He didn't drag her from pillar to post at all. Okay, this is extremely problematic, and I'll tell you why. Number one, I told you she went to fucking New York in 41, 42. She will meet Edwin Ekdahl in 42. The official story is she meets him when she's working during the Navy time in Algiers in 42. This is all false. She had to have known him, and that's why she went to New York, and that's how she got involved in the Waves program and all that stuff. There's no other explanation, period. And here Myrtle Evans is confirming she went to New York because of him. It was his work that took them to places. That's why she went to New York, because of his position, okay? That only makes sense in this 41-42 period. That's it. It doesn't make sense when they go to New York later, okay? The story on why they go to New York later makes somewhat sense. But that isn't until August of 52. They divorced in 48, so she wouldn't be talking about when she went to New York in 52. She has to be talking about when she went to New York in 41, 42. Okay? You see, this is brand new to me, and this is more and more evidence stacking up that she went to New York during this time period. And we've been lied to about how she met Ekdahl, why she met Ekdahl, his involvement and everything. But this one statement here, this one paragraph from Myrtle Evans just continues to pile evidence upon evidence that she went to New York in 41, 42. All right. I love being vindicated. Did you know Mr. Ekdahl before he married her? I did. That was his second marriage, isn't that right? Yes, so she said. He had been separated from his wife for many years, but had never gotten a divorce. I don't think. So then he did get a divorce and married Margie. Okay, but the divorce happened in 42. They didn't get married till 45. Do you remember where he was originally from? Boston, I think. He's actually from Newton, which is next to Boston. Is it your recollection that they moved to Dallas, Texas? They did. Did you visit them in Dallas? I did. At what address? 4801 Victor. Okay, they sold that in June of 45, so we're talking in a time period prior to June 45. I don't remember that because I went there with a friend of mine to the Baker Hotel, I think it was. I used to go around with this friend of mine. She was with Mary Douglas Perfumes, and Margie was living there with her husband at the time and the two children when I visited her. Okay, so this this is extremely important. I have no understanding of them ever living at the Baker Hotel, period. Definitely not with two kids, because she scooped up both of the kids out of the orphanage, or all three kids out of the orphanage, and went and moved into Victor Street. And that was in early 44. That was in like May of 44 or something like that. So when would she have been living at the Baker Hotel? I have no idea. Jesus Christ, when I see this stuff and I think about writing the next book, holy fuck, it's gonna kill me. Because I have to get every single one of these micro details in there. And I got to remember them all. And there's a ton of them. Her husband and her two children. Well, her three children, were with her, including Lee. Yes. So this has to have been after they pulled them out of the orphanage. And that was in March of 44. Yes. So between March of 44 and June of 45 is the time period she's talking about here. Yes, I went and stayed a few days with her, but the address I don't remember. We didn't correspond during those years, but that could have been the address. It was a duplex, I know, and she lived downstairs and she rented out the upstairs. At the time, Lee was around 6 years old, is that right? Yes, just about at the kindergarten stage. Let's see, she lived downstairs and she rented out the upstairs. When you visited there, were the two boys, John and Robert, living at the home? Yes, they all lived together. And Lee too? Yes. The nature of Mr. Ekdahl's work was such that he had to travel, you say. Oh, yes, he had a lot of traveling to do. I think he was a geologist. With the geology shit. He worked for an electricity company, Basco. But the geologist was often a cover for the oil guys. But being an oil guy was often a cover for something else. These independent oil men you come across like crazy in Kennedy. I think he was a geologist. That's what my husband said he was. He was with some big company that he was top man with, and he was a good deal older than Margie. Shut the fuck up with your goddamn older than Margie shit, because Robert Oswald was the same age as fucking Ekdahl. Period. Born in 1896. So they keep talking about how Ekdahl was so much older than her, but so was Robert Oswald. So I don't know why that's never brought up. You see, he was at the Roosevelt Hotel and he had nobody. And he had this blood clot and everything. And at the time, he was taking Margie out. And he wasn't too well a man because of this blood clot and all. But he wanted to marry Margie. And so she married him. And they went from Dallas to, I think, San Antonio. And I think they went to New York. And sometime after that, of course, Margie came down here and she took an apartment with me. See, she's blending time periods. She's like, this is a multi-year period that she seems to be unaware of unless Marguerite continued to have involvement with Ekdahl after the divorce, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. She got divorced. His lawyer was Fred Korth, and they got divorced in 1948. And we're talking a time period of like 4 years later. So I don't understand why she'd be still involved with Ekdahl 4 years later. And this story about going from Dallas to San Antonio, that must be talking about where they got married in Rockwall, Texas, right? That's got to be the time period. So that's talking early 45. And then they went to New York. So did she go back to New York after they got married? I know they went to Boston in the fall of 45, or that's the cover story at least. But that's the same time that Oswald's supposed to have been starting kindergarten at the Benbrook Common School on October 31st. So we have missing records from Boston and or fabricated records down in Benbrook. So this time period is a hodgepodge of misinformation, inadvertent. All right, Mr. Jenner, before we get into that, Mrs. Evans, if you don't mind, let's go back a bit and see if I have this clear in my mind. See, he knows she's talking about 54, right? He's like, no, let's back the fuck up, bitch. 10 years. You say you visited them once in Texas, right? Yes. Other than that visit, you had no contact with her, that is visually in person while she was in Texas. No, I didn't. Okay, so because she wasn't in Texas, she went to New York at that time. Now, after she was married to Ekdahl and went to Covington, she had her other two boys with her. This was in the summertime, of course. She had them in the boarding school over there, so we're talking summer of 42. Even after she married Ekdahl, this is way before. See, he's mixing up his time frames. No, she's mixing up her time frames here. She kept Lee with her all the time. She was married to Ekdahl, of course. So she's jumping forward again to 45. So that would take all three together on these business trips they had to take, and they would stay in the best hotels, of course, like the Belvedere. They had the best of everything, but that didn't seem to work out too well, having Lee with them all the time like that. This was when she was married to Ekdahl that she had some boys over at Covington. Yes, her two older sons were in boarding school, and in the summer, they would all be together over at this place in Covington. This was in 1946. Well, I just don't know what year that would have been, but I would say around there. I'm pretty sure Covington was before 46. I'm pretty sure that was in summer 43. Well, I don't know just what year that would have been, but I would say it was around there. I don't remember the exact years for a lot of this stuff, but I can just tell you the way I remember it happening. That's all right. Just go on the way you have been. The pieces will all fit together eventually, and that's what the commission wants before it brings this investigation to its conclusion. I've had so many people pass through my life, it would take something to remember all these details. Mr. Jenner then says, did you see the boys during that period? Oh, yes. She would visit me for about 3 or 4 days. I remember one time Lee was about 7 years old then. He was a little fellow. What was your impression of Lee at that time, Mrs. Evans? Well, I would say Lee was a spoiled little boy because naturally his mother kept him. I think Margie would have had a better life if she had put him in boarding school with the other two boys, because then she would have lived with Ekdahl. I understand they were separated and divorced before he died. But, a mother can throw her entire life on a child and spoil that child and let the child ruin her life for her. And Margie clung to Lee regardless. But in that respect, she was a wonderful mother. You couldn't find a better woman. Of course, when she married Ekdal, she didn't want him to support her children. She tried to support them herself. That was her own decision? Oh, yes, it was her decision. She wanted Ekdal to take her and Lee, and she kept Lee with them all the time. And I think that's one of the things that contributed to their divorce. She was too close to Lee all the time, and I don't guess Ekdal liked that too much. Now, when Margie lived in Dallas, she kept her 3 boys with her, but after she married Ekdal, she put 2 boys in boarding school, and she still kept Lee with them. See, that's back in 42. So I don't know what the fuck she's talking about. They had to leave Dallas on these trips that Mr. Ekdal made in connection with his work, but Lee would be with them. See, they got married in 45. They go to Boston in 45. And allegedly that's when these trips to Arizona and all these other places happened. But this is conflicting in my mind with the events of 42 at the Bethlehem Orphanage. So I'll have to go back and double check that. Lee was spoiled. He was just a spoiled boy. I'll put it this way. He was her baby, and she loved him to death, and she spoiled him to death. One of the older boys, and maybe both of them, I don't remember, but I think they both went into the Marines. Well, one of them went into the Coast Guard. Well, they went into the service, and both of her older boys were very, very fine boys. John Pick was a lovely boy, but of course he never did see his father. His father never did care to see the child the way I understand it. And at 18, I think he quit supporting him or something like that. Now, when Margie decided to come back to New Orleans, I think she came here from San Antonio or Fort Worth, one of those places, and she went to her sister's. Would you wait a minute now, ma'am? Was Marguerite working at that time, either in Texas, or did she go to work after she came back to New Orleans? All right, so what year are we talking about? Now, when Margie decided to come back to New Orleans, that's 54. I think she came here from San Antonio or Fort Worth. So she thinks she came there first and then came to New Orleans instead of coming directly back from New York. She's talking 54 now. Would you wait a minute now, ma'am? Was Marguerite working at the time either in Texas or did she go back to work after she came back to New Orleans? Well, she might have tried her hand at real estate at one time. And of course, she had worked in different department stores. And at the time I caught up with her and ran into her, I think she said she was working then for the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. She said she answered a blind ad in the paper and she got this job and she opened Jean's hosiery shop. And that's when we would meet and go to lunch on Saturday afternoon and we got to be friendly. See, now we're talking back in the early 40s, 41, 42 again. Or even possibly earlier, 40 to 42, somewhere around there. And you were working at this time also. Yes, sir. I was in the government then. I was an accountant and I was with the government. Okay. Now, does some of her testimony make sense? How it doesn't make sense? This woman, we already established, Marguerite and Lillian are somehow attached to intelligence in this operation. Marguerite is good friends with Myrtle Evans, and Myrtle Evans is here now admitting she was in the government. What did she do with the government? She was an accountant. What does that mean? Let's see if he presses her on that at all. Yes, sir, I was in the government then. I'm an accountant, and I was with the government. We would meet on like Thursday evenings and have dinner and shop around, and on Saturday afternoon, usually at those times, we became pretty friendly again. But then, of course, she went back to Texas. And she didn't go back to Texas. She went to New York. I used to travel with this friend of mine who was with Mary Douglas Perfumes, and she traveled out of California, and she was going to be in Dallas for a show, some kind of display show, I guess it was, and I went with her. And during that trip, I guess I stayed about a week with Margie. What kind of housekeeper was Margie? A very good housekeeper, very tasty. She could take anything and make something out of it, and something beautiful. She had a lot of natural talent that way, and she was not lazy. She would work on things by the hour for her children, and she kept a very neat house, and she was always so lovely herself, and this is great. That's why when I saw her on TV after all this happened, she looked so old and haggard, and I said, that couldn't be Margie. But of course it was. I mean, if you'd known Margie before all this happened, you'd see what I mean. She was beautiful. She had beautiful wavy hair. What about Lee? Well, Lee was a smart boy. He was no dummy. He was a bit of a bookworm, I would say. Tell me more about that. Well, he had hair like his mother, for example, but he was a loner. That's what the children all said, but of course I didn't pay too much attention to that. But he didn't bring boys in the house, and he would always seem to prefer being by himself. He wouldn't bring boys into the house? No, he never did that I know of. He would come home and he would get his books and his music, and then when he wanted supper or something to eat, he would scream like a bull. He would holler, "Ma, where's my supper?" Some of the time, Margie would be downstairs talking to me or something, and when he would holler at her, she would jump up right away and go and get him something to eat. Her whole life was wrapped up in that boy, and she spoiled him to death. Lee was about 13 at the time, I think, along in there. This is at the St. Mary address. Was this while he was living with his mother at one of your apartments? Yes, this was the last time I knew anything about Lee, when they lived at my apartment. Was this after or before she had gone to New York City? Oh, this was all after her trip to New York. She wasn't with Ekdahl anymore when she came back here. I wonder if you could hold for a minute now. I would like to have you give me your impression of Lee up to the time they returned from New York. Well, I couldn't give you much about this child because I didn't know him much. He seemed just like a normal boy. I mean, he didn't seem to be any different than his brothers as far as that goes. But the way he kept himself just wasn't normal, I don't think. I guess that's why they called him a loner, because he was alone so much. He didn't seem to want to be with any other children. Now, when she was over in Covington in the summer months, she would be there the full 3 months, I think, and they seemed to be a very happy family. They would go swimming and eat watermelon, and they had a couple of dogs, I think, in the backyard, and they would just have a good time. I would say they were a really happy family in those days. They were a happy family. As far as I could see, they were very happy, very close-knit, very much in love with each other, and these boys knew that their mother was putting them through school and giving them what they needed as best she could. She was a very good provider for her children and very decent woman. I mean, she wasn't a loose woman at all. She was a very decent and fine woman. Well, that squares with everything we have found. I don't think any mother could do more than she did for them, as far as we've been able to find out. That's right. Nobody could have done any more for their children than she did. I mean, with what she had to work with, she was never well off, I mean, financially. Oh, really? How do you fucking say she got $10,000, which is well over $150,000 today, back then, and she didn't do good financially? She even puts on her applications and stuff to the Bethlehem Orphanage that she had all this money and took all this time off. So this testimony, again, is super contradictory. When she moved to New York City, did you lose touch with her then? Yes, I lost complete touch with Margie. Did you hear from her while she was in New York? No, I don't think so. She might have written me a postcard or something, but I don't think so. Then the first time that you again began seeing her was when she came back to New Orleans, is that right? Yes. Did you hear from her or hear about her while she was living in Texas before she went to New York? Oh, yes. Like I said, I was over there in Dallas with her for a week, and I kept pretty well in touch with what she was doing. For a time she lived, what's the name of that little town? Oh, Benbrook. It could have been that. Anyway, I heard from her again that she was traveling a lot with her husband. See, Benbrook is going back to 45 again, so we're all over the place with timing. She was still living with Ekdahl then. They were living in hotels and traveling, and Lee was right with them all the time. She kept Lee with her on all these trips with Mr. Ekdahl? As far as I know, yes, she did. As far as you know, did she have Lee with her all the time? I don't think she ever parted with Lee for a minute. If she did, I don't know about it. When she came back, the way she talked, I figured that Lee was with them the whole time and that they had lived in hotels and things like they did when Mr. Ekdahl was traveling. Do you recall when her marriage to Ekdahl took place, Mrs. Evans? Well, it was about the time she went to Texas, just about that time. Around 1945. Would that have been in maybe 44? Along in there, yes. She married him, I think, in Dallas, Texas, or maybe it was Fort Worth. I really can't be sure. But he had been there in New Orleans, and that's when they struck up this acquaintanceship here in New Orleans. Is that right? That's right. She said that he had a heart attack. Is that right? Yes, she did. And he was courting her during this time. Yes, sir. His sister came down from Boston. Is that right? To sort of see how he was getting along. Is that correct? That's right. I guess that's what prompted her to come down here, and because he had this trouble, and I guess she was concerned about him. And that courtship between him and Marguerite ripened into marriage then, is that right? Yes. Did Ekdahl's sister approve of Marguerite? Oh, yes. She wanted her to marry Ekdahl. And before she went back to Boston, Margie made her a promise that she would look after him. Then Margie moved to Texas with Mr. Ekdahl. Is that right? Yes, sir. And you say you visited them over there in Dallas. Is that right? Yes, sir, I did. And you think you might have heard from her at different times when she was traveling with her husband. That's right. You know, postal cards and such. And then you didn't hear from her for a while. Is that right? That's right. And then you said you heard from her again. Yes. Would you give me a little of the circumstances of that now, please? Well, she called me, most likely. She was at her sister's. She was looking for an apartment. Excuse me, but when you say your sister's, who do you mean? Lillian Moret. She had only that one sister here. She was had a good many years. She was a good many years older than Margie. Margie was the baby of the family. She took care of her father, that is, until his death, and she kept house for her father too. I guess there is about 10 years difference between the two. That's why I guess they have not been too close. But anyway, she called me and asked about an apartment, and I told her I could give her an apartment and that I would let her have it cheaper than I would somebody else that I didn't know. Now, they didn't have any furniture, but there were a few pieces left in the apartment, and her sister provided some things, and I found a few things for her. She made out with that. Do you remember what year that was? Well, I remodeled the apartment about 10 years ago, so I would say that was around 1954, along in there, in the early spring, I think it was. In early spring? Well, it may have been a little later. It could have been in May or June of 54, but possibly a little earlier than that. I can't remember that well enough to be definite on the month. Where was this apartment? 1454 St. Mary, apartment 6. But now finally Margie decided she couldn't afford that apartment and moved, despite the fact that I was renting it to her for less than I would have anyone else. And I told her that. She came in one day and said, Myrtle, I'm going to give that apartment up. She told me she had seen a house around St. Bernard that would be cheaper. She said she had rode around and looked at the house and she thought she would take it. She had an automobile? No, she rode the bus out there. She had no complaints about your apartment, did she? She just found a cheaper place to move? Oh, she was perfectly happy in the apartment. She said she liked it, but that she just couldn't afford it. Who else was in the apartment besides Marguerite? Just her and Lee. Did you see Lee after they returned from New York? Oh, yes. They lived in my house for, I guess, about 6 months. Including Lee. Oh, yes. She and Lee lived in your home for 6 months. In this apartment, yes. In the number 6 apartment. Yes, you see, I had this great big house with about 27 rooms or more. It was just one big building, is that right? Yes, but it was converted into modern apartments, and they took one of them. You see, one of the smaller apartments. I had one tenant prior to her, so she was the second tenant in this little apartment. And that was at 1454 St. Mary Street. Correct. So she and her son Lee occupied that apartment for approximately 6 months, is that right? Yes. And that was in 1954, you say? Yes, maybe not exactly that year, but along there. Did you get to see both of them frequently? Practically every day. All right. Hang on a second. Let me see here. All right. Now tell me about this period while they lived at your home. Just transport yourself back there 10 years ago. What did Lee Oswald look like? What did he look like? Yes, and what did he do? What impression did he make on you then? Not what you heard, but what you remember now about him. Well, he was more spoiled. More than before? Yes, he had gotten older, and he wanted his way, and he was a teenager then, and like all teenagers, he was very difficult. Of course, I guess that all teenagers are that way because they're not yet grown, and they are not a child either. The best of them are very trying, and it's hard to keep them in line. In that respect, Lee wasn't any different than any other teenage boy, I guess. Now, this was the period after which Lee returned from New York, is that right? Yes, after they came here from New York. With his mother, yes. What did they say to you as to why they returned from New York and came to New Orleans? Well, I don't know that they said anything, but it seems to me now that they came right from Texas over to New Orleans, then not right from New York. I could be mistaken there, but I think they went back to Texas from New York. Hang on a second. Let me just pause really quickly and see how much more testimony we have for her. All right, we have a good little chunk left. We got at least 10 pages left of her testimony. So I'm going to wrap it up here for today, and we'll continue on with this testimony of Myrtle Evans next time. Thanks, everybody.